Hello and welcome to the Leo Baeck Institute London podcast. To mark International Women's Day 2024, in this episode I'll be talking to Pauline Paucker, someone who's been involved with the Institute for over 7 decades. She's met just about everyone important who's been involved with the Institute since its founding. She's worked on our yearbook. She's been a scholar of German Jewish women typographers. And of course, she was married to the LBI London's long-standing director, Arno Paucker. So she has a lot of experience, and we tried to talk about as much of it as we could in the space of an hour. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
My name is Joe Cronin. I'm the director of the Leo Baeck Institute London, and we're delighted to be here today speaking to Pauline Paucker, who has a long and interesting lived experience with the Institute and has done much else besides. So yes, we're delighted to be able to speak to you, and I understand you've recently celebrated your 95th birthday.
Yes, I'm 95 in 1 month.
And 1 month.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I guess the question that I always start interviews with is, where were you born and where did you grow up?
Oh, I'm from Birmingham. I'm not from London. And my parents met before the First World War, when the young Jewish people were marrying what was called out, because there was really no place for them to meet. And so they would meet at charity balls in the town hall, which is where my father met my mother, who was very beautiful. And he fell for her. And then, of course, she was not typical for the Jewish community of Birmingham, inasmuch as her parents hadn't come from, her father probably came from a shtetl in Belarus, and he died when my mother was 10. But her mother was the daughter of a rabbi in Silesia, a very autocratic rabbi, and I'm named after his wife, Paulina, obviously, a very unhappy woman, unhappily married into a forced marriage. And they had 6 living children. She must have been pregnant every year. Photographs of her with a baby who died. And the children, of course, left home, and they left the faith to a great extent. One became a Catholic. One married one of the founders of the Spanish Socialist Party. And I'm in touch with this now Italian family. And, of course, the one who stayed in Germany, you can imagine his fate and that of one of his daughters. But I'm in touch with this extended family called Resiansky. They kept together very much. And my mother was sent to Germany to learn German with her uncle in April 1914. And of course, in August came the war. My father, who was trying out a new motorbike, he was an engineer, motorbiked all the way back to Birmingham and joined the Royal Warwicks, because his fiancée was in the hands of the Hun. That's what he told me. And then she was very moved by this broken man, blown up and gassed, who came back and agreed to marry him. But it wasn't the happiest of marriages, I would say. And I have a brother who has his older brother who died. But I met Arno because at the end of the war, my grandmother and her youngest sister, 20 years between them, were exchanging letters. My darling sister, so much has happened, such terrible things have happened to our family and the world. You must come to Florence. We are in Florence. Come to Florence. So, of course, we all went. My father refused to go, but my mother, my brother, and myself, we all went to Florence. And, of course, the 2 sisters remembered that they'd always disliked one another and immediately began arguing. My poor mother was pig in the middle. And so that didn't last very long, their visit to Florence. They went back, and I stayed with my cousins in their villa on the Vecchia Fiesolana, as you go out. And I had joined the first after the war, what would it be, kind of course for foreigners, art, language, culture. And Arno had joined the German one in order that he could have a sort of acknowledgement that he was living in Italy, because he'd been there on bribes. He'd been demobbed in Italy, wanted to stay there. But his brother, who'd had a hair-raising escape from a French school to Switzerland, was already in America, and he wanted to join him there. And he was waiting for an American visa. He still had a British Mandate territory passport. It wasn't yet the Declaration of Israel, which made him stateless, actually. And he was taken in, you might say, by an Italian Jewish philanthropist, Mario Bear, and was living in some splendor down in Piazza d'Azeglio. And that, as I say, we met. He followed me around Santa Croce Church and then introduced himself to the English group. His English was quite, well, he'd had been 5 years in the British Army. His English was quite good. Not perfect, but quite good at that time. And, so we knew one another for about 4 or 5 weeks. And then he wrote and suggested I come out to America. And he paid the fare. He was working as a packer. America is a very hard country if you've got no qualifications of any kind. You can't even be a clerk without a lousy BA from somewhere. Whereas I said in England, somebody looking like Arno with glasses would be assumed to be an intellectual and would immediately get a job. He was a shipping clerk in Birmingham. And I had a teaching qualifications, so I became a teacher here. No, in Birmingham first. In kind of international school on the border.
Was this in this?
In Solihull, which pretends it isn't Birmingham, but it is.
Yeah. Well, I'm from Birmingham as well, actually.
Oh, are you from really? What part? We always say that.
Yeah, from South Birmingham.
I'm from Edgbaston.
I was born in Edgbaston.
There. I grew up there. And I went to King Edward's.
Oh, yes. I tried to... Anyway, it's not about me.
Yes.
Incredible. Okay. So you've mentioned Italy, you've mentioned America, and now you're back in Birmingham.
Yes.
Okay. So what?
Till I was about 31, 32.
Okay.
And meanwhile, I'd put Arno through university. He had was Birmingham. And then he had a dreadful year teaching in Slough to get a teaching certificate. He survived that. His successor was carried out in an ambulance, I believe. And then he hawked his thesis round. He was fascinated by the Volksbuch, because Roy Pascal, his professor, was a Volksbuch enthusiast, and Arno became one too. And he realized they'd been transcribed into Yiddish. And it was generally considered they were straight transcriptions with no alteration. But he wondered. And, he didn't know any Yiddish. German Jews were very careful to distance themselves from what they said was jargon or something. And but he knew Hebrew. I'm told by some saucy Israeli consultant that your husband speaks a beautiful Hebrew. Where did he learn it? Well, yes, where did he? And so knowing Hebrew and being very keen on Middle High German, which is Yiddish. It just transliterated with Hebrew letter. He felt he could deal with this, and he spent 2 very happy years. He found somebody in Nottingham. The professor there was a Volksbuch enthusiast. The one he was good on, King, his name was, Dukas Horan. I was drawn into this. Arno drew everybody into whatever interested him. And by then I was fascinated by the idea of people in ghettos reading stories about knights and their ladies and all the stuff of folklore. Anyway, he discovered that there's a hell of a lot of changes. Some of them concealed criticisms of Christianity. And his thesis is still read and quoted. It's obviously it's at Nottingham somewhere, but it's Yiddish versions of the German folkbook. So when he applied to he went back to Nottingham, was his story, and Birmingham, and there was his Professor Pascal saying, "Have you got a job yet?" And Arno said, "Well, no, as a matter of fact, I haven't." And he said, "Well, there's somebody here looking for a director. Have you ever heard of the Leo Baeck Institute?" And Arno said, "No, I haven't. And he said, well, Ezra Benathan, who was there as a lecturer, is looking for, he was on the board at the time, he's looking for a director with an English link, not just a German Jew with some English link. So Arno fitted it very well. And then when he became director, he looked up the interviews they'd had with various people. And on his name, it said, which I think he thought was funny, sehr versiert und extrovertiert. It was very funny and very true.
Well, for me, yeah. Okay, so we're now in the 50s or the 60s, I'm not sure. Somewhere around then. And what about your own education and your own kind of...
Mine? Well, I grew up in wartime when everything was upside down. And I decided our horizons as women were so limited. The women who taught us had remembered being stymied at every effort at an independent life or intellect. Today, these women who taught me would be university lecturers, but then the most they could do was become a headmistress or grammar school. And I just felt I didn't want to become an English teacher and read English at university, which was what was offered to me, and end up just saying, open your books at page 56. I decided I wanted to be old Mrs. Whatnot up in the art room. And I had a certain amount of talent. And so I couldn't go up to London in the bombing. My parents wouldn't dream of it. So I went to Birmingham Art School, which is a very, what shall I say, I realize now it was a very good education they gave us. It was still influenced by the arts and crafts movement. And I did a kind of interview with Raphael Gross's artist wife, and she's apparently going to make it into something. I thought it was all asking me about this type of art education and arts and crafts movement lingering on in the provinces and everything. It's quite
Birmingham, yeah, it does still have...
very much in Birmingham. I mean, we're a town of manufacturers and small manufacturers, but the arts and crafts movement really hit quite hard. I mean, I can remember visiting houses, William Morris curtains, but where they were completely covered in William Morris furnishing intact, and merchants, widows, and so on. Yeah, so that's quite interesting in that way. So as I say, I was 18 when I met Arno. Mm-hmm. And I think I was 20 when I was married. My parents were furious.
Were they?
Yes, my mother in particular. She said, I don't like German Jews, although she was related to them. And there's nothing nicer than the nicest kind of Englishman.
An Englishman who wasn't a Jew, presumably?
Well, I mean, my father was a Methodist.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was never able to accept the doctrine of the Trinity when he was a lay preacher. So he liked monotheism. He was very attracted to Judaism. And Islam, oddly enough. So what shall I say? It was a curious household in a way. Although they thought they were perfectly normal and commonplace. It's only now I realize that really they weren't.
Yes, I mean you do hear about these interesting pairings, but I suppose each one is unusual in its own way. I think, especially at that time when it was much more of a taboo, I suppose, to marry someone from a different religion.
Yes, to step out of your group.
Exactly.
was not considered the thing to do.
Yeah, not
at all, whatever the group might be.
Yes.
And my mother was not in any way a person of religious feeling. She saw Judaism as a social group to which she wished to belong. She did and she didn't.
So she wasn't religious?
Not at all, no. It had no meaning for her.
But still felt some...
She felt strongly attached to the idea of Judaism and Jews.
Culturally, I see. Yeah. Okay. And was that... Do you think that was a factor in what drew you to your husband, or was it just a good match of personalities?
I don't know. I mean, it just if you marry outside your group, it's often has to be a strong attraction, I think, to do that. To suddenly find somebody like-minded.
Yes.
Which yes, we were in tastes and ideas and so on. He was further to the left than I am. I'd never joined anything. He was a great joiner. I think he was a Trotskyite at one point.
Oh, really?
Yes. And then he was a young communist. They would never accept him in the Communist Party because he was too mocking and questioning.
Wow.
His friends were all accepted from his school, Ben Sherman. That's an interesting picture, that whole school and what happened to this incoming German Jewish group.
Yeah.
That they all ended up as, what should I say, respectable members of society.
Yes, yeah, a lot of them did establish themselves in the sort of English intelligentsia, one way or the other.
Yes, Lacour, for instance. Walter Lacour, who came from Breslau, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Goodness, okay, so he really was, at one point, quite far to the left.
Oh, yes. He said it was a push because they saw them as the only answer to Nazism.
I see.
And as a boy in Germany, he was recruited for distributing leaflets, like Hobsbawm, the same group probably. Hobsbawm a bit older, wasn't he? And he realized it was a communist infiltration of the Jewish youth movement.
Right. I see. So
he once spoke at this in Luxembourg, I think. We both gave papers at that conference. And the chairman was a slightly older person who very wrongly interrupted Arno and said that this was all not true, that he had been a young teacher and there was no such infiltration of any of the young youth movement. And then Arno was defended by everybody from the floor. So it was his experience.
Yeah. This was later on?
Luxembourg was in the 70s, I think, yeah. But there were still people around from that time.
Yeah. I think, yeah, you're right. There was a specific political context to, these young people joining communist groups. Yes. And it was the threat of fascism and Nazism.
That's right. They saw them as the only real opponent.
Yeah.
And were attracted to this in particular. There were two communist parties in Israel. They split, a pro-Zionist and an anti-Zionist. And they're tiny. But they existed. They had Arab members, but not many.
That's an interesting story in itself, I imagine.
These left-wing Arabs. Arno once was invited to the former DDR, to lecture, and he had to listen to other historians speaking from the East, and they kept on saying the Arabische Sozialistische Brudervölker, and Arno got tired of hearing this, so he thought, what will I do when I speak? So he began to say, from Standpoint der Arabische Sozialistische, they all began to laugh. And then as they left, walking across the open Potsdamer Platz, they said, ach, wissen Sie, Herr Paucker, what can we do? We have to say it. We know there's none of them there.
I see. Gosh, that does say something about the GDR, I think, and their very rigid doctrinal position on these things.
Yes, and they wouldn't speak up.
Did you spend time in Israel?
Israel, I've only been twice for what have I been for? A couple of conferences with Arno.
So you never lived there?
No, have you ever been there?
No, actually, no, I haven't.
No.
But Arno had spent time as well.
He didn't. He had still school friends there. In fact, I'm still in touch with the daughter of one of the school friends, Ronit, who's living in an arid shelter, as far as I can see, in Tel Aviv. I must email her tonight. but she's the daughter of his friend. And yes, he kept in very close touch with the boys and girls that he'd been together with in the school.
Right. Because, I mean, I suppose I ask because German Jews often had a rather prickly relationship with Israel, including the ones who emigrated there, as I'm sure you know about, but I just wondered what Arno's feeling was, what your feeling was over the decades that you watched this. I mean, you've seen the state from its inception through all the decades of its existence, and as you mentioned, it started off with a more of a left-leaning disposition, and gradually it's, I suppose, changed in its political outlook. And so I wondered what yours and what Arno's view was about that, whether it was still a place that you felt an attachment to, that a place where you had friends, or was it a place where you didn't feel any particular affinity with?
Arno may have been a Zionist for 6 weeks. He belonged to the Werkleute group, which he liked. He was a great joiner of youth movements, and when he became editor of the Yearbook, he put in a lot about the youth movements and so on, which were very strong in Germany from the First World War on. Young people would girls would put flowers in their hair, and they'd go out to the nature and the countryside and so on. And of course, the Jewish groups followed suit, which was specifically Jewish. He belonged not to a Jewish group originally, I think Republikaner or something. And then he remembered with great emotion the burning of the flags of all the youth movements when the majority had to go into the Hitlerjugend, and the Jews were allowed to continue with their own purely Jewish groups. Right. And he chose Werkleute because it was left-wing and more romantic. People would read Rilke and the Hermann Hesse over the sort of fires and things like that. And maybe he became a Zionist for about 6 or 7 weeks.
Right.
And then in the school, when he was there, he was moved to the left non-Zionist communist group.
Right.
As a schoolboy.
As a schoolboy.
Yes. But he was seen as, I think the German word is Zersetzendes or something. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't even allowed to join the illegal Haganah in school. All his friends did.
He wasn't allowed to?
They didn't want him because he was too questioning and too critical and opened his mouth. I see. And wrote poems, something.
The pitfalls of being a scholar, I think, is that you end up a kind of outsider.
Yeah.
In many groups.
It's you're questioning. Yes, and people don't like it.
No.
I mean, Arno sent his archive to the Leobeck Institute archive, Aubrey Pomeranz in Berlin. Mm-hmm. And the children's newspaper from the school that he and others ran is there. Mm-hmm. And some people are already working on this stuff. He left it open. He didn't put a bar on it.
Great.
Mm. There's nothing much personal.
Okay, so we've got to a point where Arno is director of the still relatively new.
Very new.
Yeah, Leobeck Institute.
1950s, wasn't it?
Yes.
It was Leobeck, of course, whose name was given to a rabbinical school and to an old age home. So the institute was constantly badgered with people either wanting a rabbi for some service or claiming that their old aunt or whoever was in the old age home. Mm-hmm. But that stopped eventually.
Yeah, I would say it still happens a little bit. Yeah, we get confused with the Leobeck College.
Yes. They just spread the name.
Yeah. Yes.
And of course, Martin Buber.
Yes. So there are some real luminaries in it.
Of course. That's right. What was left over, really. And Arno met Buber 3 times.
Mm-hmm. Who did you meet?
Eh?
Who did you meet in those early
Oh, but no, I knew all the board, and Alfred Wiener I knew.
Okay.
Very hard-going. His grandson, Finkelstein, is very amiable to talk to, but Wiener was anything but.
Oh, really?
He thought he was God Almighty. You couldn't approach him. You couldn't, like the royal family, you couldn't talk to him first. You had to wait for him to speak to you. He was really furious with me because I spoke to him first, the first time I met him.
Did he? Was that because you're a woman, or because
Could be a combination.
could be a combination?
Yes.
Yeah.
Laissez majesté as well.
Okay, so that's Alfred Wiener.
And of course, Robert Welch, who I admired immensely.
Robert Welch.
Yes, I have a letter upstairs in my folder of great bitterness and sadness that everything he had hoped for as a Zionist was destroyed. It was Begin in particular. He didn't see Netanyahu, but he just felt that whatever he had desired of a Jewish state was being destroyed
That kind of.
by this Jabotinsky and
Right.
a gaggle of people.
I see. So
And
he
like
was-
the heirs of Jabotinsky.
right. So he must have been fairly left wing as well.
Not really. I think he was conservative, liberal, maybe. I'm not sure.
Liberal.
Maybe.
Okay.
He was a man of great charm, but then he wasn't German Jew. He was an Austrian Jew.
Does that make it
It
significant?
does. The Habsburg Empire gave a slightly different touch, I think.
Less severe, maybe.
Yes, more willing to ingratiate yourself with people,
I see.
which perhaps the German Jews didn't bother so much with. This is a very broad statement.
Well, we have to deal in generalities sometimes, I suppose.
Too, I also met Hans Kohn.
Mm,
That was marvelous. And he had all the charm of the Habsburg Empire.
right.
The Czech. He was even flirtatious as an older man.
I hope in an entirely respectful manner.
Well, I trust so, of course. He was enchanted by he came here at the time when very short miniskirts were the fashion. And he was enchanted with it, he told me. These lovely legs that he saw in the street. You can't imagine Alfred Wiener.
It doesn't sound entirely decorous, but still. Good. Well, on the subject of Robert Welch, you said you admired him, but he didn't sound like he was much of a feminist or much of someone who had a great deal of respect for women. You mentioned Eva Reichmann, and
Well, yes. I don't think he was the main sort of person to object to her. He liked women as Viennese like women, pretty little things to have around and so on. And but I can remember a conversation at some evening party at their house where he was declaring that women should never have had the vote. And Eva Reichmann, who was there, said, "Ah, Robert." And he said, but it was the women's vote which put Hitler in power, which I was told by Peter Pulser, who was sort of psephologist, was a fact.
I think there's some debate around.
I was going to say, I doubt it.
There is some debate, and my understanding was that it's not quite true.
No, I feel that, but it was a general idea floating about. It was the women who did it, pushed him the extra votes. And but Robert, the idea that women should therefore not have a vote, it shook me, even if he thought that he said it.
Yeah, this is quite some time after women had the vote in Germany, in Britain. So there was yes, I suppose you're right. He was a conservative, certainly in some respects.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in his old age, I mean, his much younger wife, Irena Welch, died, and he was obviously bereft because there was no one to look after him. He was incapable of even getting water from the tap, I think, and everybody tried out housekeepers, and he quarreled with them all. So then the daughter from one of his marriages, his wife had died, was living in Israel, and she said, well, come to Israel. And, but she, with very sort of narrow quarters, she couldn't put him up with. And so he was in an old age home where he was given a flat to himself. Everybody else had rooms. So people were already cross with him for having this privilege. And he hated it. I have another letter, maybe it's one of these drawers, a marvelous description of a day in his life in this home and how bitter and narrow it was. And then we visited him there for the last time. And he was referring to it was nearly all women, there were hardly any men. And they were taking their Friday night supper up with a glass of wine as they had. And he said, these are hexen. And of course they heard him say that. I mean, you can imagine how much he was loved. And
I wonder why because I mean, he could have made his life easier for himself, I think, from the sound of things.
I mean, well, like me, he was a passionate opera lover. And apparently I wrote to him. I'd forgotten, I mean, I have these 2 letters, but there's a box in the LBI in New York. It says, amusing letters from Pauline Paucker. And I'd forgotten I'd written to him so often. And then in the other letter he writes to me, he thanks me for my letters and says I've described all the operas for him that he longed and longed to see and couldn't. He must have heard the greatest singers of Europe if he grew up in Prague, went to Vienna and then Berlin. Well, I mean, he must have heard everyone who was anyone at that time. And it was his passion. He had his 75th birthday in Covent Garden. We were all invited to champagne in the Crash Bar. That was it. He took a ticket. And it was Gounod's Faust, which I'm not that keen on. Mm-hmm. But it was, he wanted this. He was really a man of pre-1914 Europe.
Right, yeah. Mm. I think it's now quite difficult to relate to that set of cultural values, not least because the world that he came from.
Exactly. Where Jews were emancipated as far as, there were certain bars, but on the whole they felt that this was a real life for them. And he was a product of that feeling. He thought the Habsburg Empire was the ideal society.
Right. Yeah, I heard actually that a lot of Jews from the Habsburg Empire had a very high opinion of that model of a state.
Yes.
And really,
Well, I think it's because it was a dying empire. I think an empire at the end of its life is much more lax, like the British Empire at the end of its life. Or even, there's another historian whose name escapes me. He believed the Ottoman Empire was the ideal society. Well,
I suppose it's a matter of perception. But yeah, no, I've heard that, and I think Jews were relatively well treated, in the Habsburg Empire compared to other nation states in Europe. Okay. Well, I suppose there's a long history, isn't there, of you and your husband with the LBI London, and the thing that I keep hearing about those years is how many connections you made, how many people you knew and entertained, and it sounded like you were a real sort of hub, sort of as a pair. You held a lot of things together and you drew a lot of people in.
Well, it's hard to say. I don't think, I was thinking this morning about the women in the LBI, that the wives of the board members paid no, I'm on the railway train. They played no part.
No part.
Irena Welsh, when I came, was one of the proofreaders. I was sucked into it as a proofreader. And it was Irena Welsh. It was Welsh's secretary, Dora Zegel. It was Mrs. Barter, who came from another Jewish organization. And it was somebody whose name I've forgotten, who was a picture dealer. She dealt with refugees who brought paintings with them and sold them, lived that way. And they were all cheerfully pressed into service by Robert Welch as proofreaders. And when I came, there was quite a argy-bargy going on about, obviously every book which is published has a misprint.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have one book I've written, private press, and there's one terrible clanger in it. But my printer says, perfection belongs only to Allah. Every carpet has to have a flaw in it because you must have one flaw. So every book. Anyway, this one they had taken an essay from an American contributor and they had altered the word teetotal. They had assumed that it was misspelled, T-E-E, total, and had changed it to TEA, thinking English people drink a lot of tea. It must have something to do with that. And of course, immediately the phones rang, as they did after every publication of the Yearbook, with everybody just leaping on whatever error they saw. And they were in consternation and asked me to come in and say what was right and what was wrong. So I had to tell them, well, as you all know, I'm sure it's an American word. T stands for total abstinence. It was the anti-alcohol campaign. And the author was correct and they were wrong. So Robert Welch, hearing of this, said, then she's got to be the proofreader from now on.
Oh, right. But that was his idea of the role of women, was to do proofreading.
Some kind of, my wife needn't go on with it anymore. Irene can repeat it, that kind of thing.
Silly.
And so I became a proofreader, and then I became a sub-editor. And then eventually I became an author. But Arno said I had to get published by someone else before he could publish me, that it wouldn't be correct. So one of Arno's colleagues asked me to write on Jews in English literature. That's behind me. Everywhere there's a Jew, there's a slip in the book, which I'd been doing for years, actually. Yeah. And then, as I say, I became an author with a young friend. And again, that is still quoted because we were able to interview people. I did Jews in the Book, fine book production and Jewish graphic artists. And after that, I did a lot of work on that. And my young friend, Justin, joined me on that. He was... He died young, unhappily, but we're still quoted as House Paucker because we were able to interview people who died soon after, like Bertolt Wolper and Henrion and so on. So we were lucky in that way to catch them before they vanished. So that was quite good. So I've enjoyed the Leo Baeck Institute enormously. It's a fascinating group of people, isn't it? German Jewry.
I think, well, certainly. I think the makeup of the Institute has probably changed a lot over the decades, and there are very few of the first generation German Jews who set it up still alive. But I think the academic interest in German Jewry is still very strong, and there are lots of interesting new avenues that are being explored. For example, looking at the role of women, which is, as you know,
fairly new, yeah,
has been overlooked. Yeah, which reminds me, actually, you wrote a biography of a German Jewish calligrapher, I think.
Oh, would you like to see it?
You have it.
I have 4 copies, actually. It's fetching quite a lot second hand, which is that my printer doesn't get tuppence.
Oh, wow.
He lives on. All these books are from his press. This is in a box.
Gosh, that's lovely.
Yes, it last sold for 500 second hand at Chichester Art Gallery. And we sold it at the beginning at 140 or 145.
Oh gosh, yeah, that's not just
No, that's all hand.
a regular book, is it?
No, it's all handmade paper, hand printed
For the
with a
benefit
press, like this.
for the benefit of anyone listening and who can't see this absolutely lovely.
It's online. We allowed it to be completely put up online by a Canadian university.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there you go. Not quite the same, but still.
No, you can't handle it, but it's there for anyone to look at.
So it's called The Working Life of Elizabeth Friedland.
Friedland.
And so it's a sort of collection of her.
I found her archive in Dublin, in Cork. She retired to Ireland in the end, and people sort of not forgot about her, but said, "Oh, you won't find anything out about her." And I just rang and wrote to everybody I could think of, and somebody answered one day and said, "I knew her," sort of Irish voice, and she'd left everything in boxes as though she'd wanted it turned into something.
I see, and so you've kind of put her work.
Because Arno helped me with the German, because a lot of German correspondence. Yeah. She left in 1936 for Italy and then for London on a domestic service permit.
Right.
She came here.
So yeah, I suppose she would be a figure of a German Jewish figure who perhaps you played a role in bringing her work to a wider audience.
Yes, we were able to do that with quite a few people. I mean, it stirred up other people interested in type. And yes, she was lost in a way. Although her lovely Friedlander type is available online as a computerized version of it. It's called Elizabeth type because it was 1930 whatnot. That's the bold. I'm not so keen on the bold. I like the italic best. And she was one of, I think, the only woman to design a type between the wars. It wasn't a woman's profession.
Must have been, yeah.
A commercial type.
I can't imagine many women were.
There's Anna Simons. She designed a few types, but I don't think they were put into commercial.
Right.
Something like that.
No. Well, we'll have to find this type and use it for everything.
Yes, the institute, when Arno came, was an emigre institute entirely, and nearly all the authors of the first few yearbooks were emigres.
Yeah.
And it was Welsh's marvellous prefaces which bound them together and gave a lot of material. Many people bought the book for his prefaces in a way, so they said. And then Arno decided that it should move into a more academic sphere, and in particular British academic life.
Yeah.
And so he got people on the board, like Peter Pulser and Werner Mosse. Werner Mosse was an adolescent when he came here after his father was murdered, I think.
Yeah.
And it changed the whole aspect.
Yeah, right. I see. So it started off.
That's right. And then the old guard was still there, who'd had a career in Germany pre-Hitler, like Rosenbaum and Fuchs and Welch, of course, Jüdisch and Schau. And then Arno moved out to the younger German historians who became friends, and also women. Arno he said he was a feminist. He was in practice, but he still had the ideas from the past. You can't shake them off, I think. Anyway, he became on due terms with these young, like Reinhard Ruhr or Steffi Schwenzel and Monika Wischert, all these. And you can see if we arrived by train in Berlin with other Werner Mosse and other people, they were shocked to see Arno being kissed and embraced by young German women of this kind. It was a step they couldn't take.
Right.
They couldn't offer do.
Right. To younger women.
Or even to men.
Or even to younger men.
No, to colleagues. The older men. And certainly Rosenbaum and the other chap and so on. They couldn't do it. Couldn't bring themselves to do it.
Right. So there was that
It was a gulf.
generational or cultural?
Yes, and cultural, I would think, and what they'd experienced in Nazi Germany. I mean, Arno was a boy, he left at 15, and these were people in their 20s already. Either they're in the Zentralverein or they're in Zionist groups. And they were standoffish with other Germans.
Yeah.
One noticed that.
Yeah. I see. It's to do with that. Yeah. Right.
It's beautifully done, isn't it, by Graham? I think when I first was introduced to him by my friend Justin, I said I didn't like his books very much, a bit too fancy. And he said, look, Pauline, each book he does is better than the last. And that's true, because one or two of the later ones are better than that even. That we worked together, it was a great treat.
Yeah, I mean, it's a book of the kind of a almost like a bygone age of books where they have this it feels like an object of art in itself rather than just
it's a great here's in its little box.
Good. Okay. Robert Welch. I know I did want to talk more about women, I suppose, but Robert Welch is another interesting figure whose name has cropped up as maybe another tricky personality, someone who was maybe also deeply affected as a young person by events in Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
And maybe never really found his feet in this country, but maybe took some solace from the Leo Baeck Institute as a gathering point for like-minded scholars of his background, perhaps?
This I don't know. The German Jewish community, when they founded it, the two opposed groups did what's called buried the hatchet. That is the Zionists and the assimilationists. And the English group here were more assimilationists, like Hans Reichmann and maybe Rosenbaum. Yeah. And Welch was correspondent here in the war for Haaretz. He was a war correspondent.
Yeah.
Here in London. So he had a foot in London life. Yeah. And his stepdaughter married Vicky, the cartoonist. And he loved London. That's what he regretted in Jerusalem, that he was no longer in London.
Right.
And it was a curious meeting. The Jerusalem people, of course, was Zionists. And Siegfried Moses, Arno always said it was a wonder that now dismissed word symbiosis, which is considered the wrong word to use. Yes. And but Siegfried and Moses, the two heroes of German and Jewish sort of mythology, really, that he represented it. He was a humorless, totally humorless man. Right. He once sent a telegram. His secretary sent the meet Moses Monday, that said. So Arno said, with or without the tablets of the law. They wanted sycophants around them. Yeah. Moses in particular.
Right.
And there were like many kingdoms that they made for themselves, because he'd been a minister of finance in Israeli government.
I see.
Moses, because they felt a German would be above corruption or bribery. So it was totally
true, yeah.
Yeah, why not? So he was a kind of commanding figure when he came to London. He didn't go to New York all that often. And New York, women. Max Kreutzberger was the leading figure in New York, quite alarming man. And he was given the task of building up an archive. They divided it. London would do the academic sort of work and a yearbook. Jerusalem would do the Hebrew stuff. And America, New York, would be the archive and sort of mini museum kind of place to visit. And the German reparation monies were divided between the three. There was a lot of archie-barchie about this, as you can imagine. In fact, Jerusalem and New York would have liked to close London. and divide the monies between.
Yeah, I heard. Yeah.
That's right. So Arno was sort of in constant, tomorrow we close. But he was able to raise quite a lot of money, particularly from an American patron who became a friend, Sheldon Nash. But that was something else. But this Max Kreuzberger, I didn't know what the position was in Germany. He was a functionary of German society, German Jewish society, obviously. And he was a very aggressive and commanding figure. And he went around Germany trying to get stuff. And he met a very competent librarian in Munich, Irmi Ferg. And she became his mistress. And he and his wife, who'd been also allowed some license, set up a ménage à trois. And da in New York, then later in Locarno in Switzerland, 2 flats together. And they built up this extraordinary archive, Max Kreuzberger, largely by bullying. Because when he asked us to go and visit some widow of a poet, and we saw, yes, of course they have to keep it, he was furious with us. He said, you've got to bully to get the stuff. Because Aubrey Pomeranz is good at getting, but he doesn't bully. He wheedles. But Max bullied. And so on. It's got to go to New York. It mustn't go to the German list, and so on. And Irmi Ferg did the kind of soft, soaping stuff. She was very sweet, charming. Well, after Max Kreuzberger died, she took over the bibliography of the Yearbook, which was very good. It wasn't only the books. It was also little condensed sentence saying what was in the books. It was really very well done and much appreciated. And that was Irmi. It was her work.
It was her work.
And then after that, Arno got friendly with Dr. Barbara Zucchi from Düsseldorf, who had been working on the Jews of Düsseldorf. And she took over with Irmi the bibliography. And then Annette Pringle from the Wiener Library also got involved in in fact, the whole bibliography all these years was entirely done by a group of women.
Right. And was that acknowledged?
Not really.
No.
Yes and no.
Yes and no. But if one were to go back through the issues of the yearbook from, well, I suppose the 60s or 70s, you'd find all of this work in the... I think we'll have to draw attention to it then in that case.
Yes, they were there and were very busy. What else did I notice here? Irmi Ferg, the bibliography, that's right, the dread Barbara Zucchi. And then back to Dr. Welsh. Arno had been, I have to use the word dumped with, as a secretary and personal assistant, a very disturbing German Jewish refugee, a woman of great malice and backbiting and upset everybody who was with her and so on. And poor Arno had cracking headaches dealing with her. And eventually she retreated and retired. And at the same time, one of Arno's fellow students from Birmingham, who we became very friendly with some of them, she came to Arno in great distress. Her husband, a Bank of England personage, had walked out and she needed a testimonial to look for a new job. And so Arno told me, he said to her, I'm not giving you a testimonial, I'm giving you a job. You're going to be my personal assistant. And then he went off to Robert Welsh and said, with great pleasure, now, the Greister Schindler is gone, I've got somebody marvelous. And he said, she's got a good upper second in German, she's personable, she's, everybody will like her, she has great capacity, she was a registrar. She said, Dr. Welsh said, that's all very well. Can she make good coffee? That's important. And he meant it.
It feels a bit like women could have played a bigger role in the early decades of the Institute had it not been for people like Robert Welch, who had very particular ideas about where the woman's place was.
That's right, Rosenbaum as well, definitely.
And it's a terrible shame because it sounds like there was a great deal of talented women who could have probably done more than they were allowed to do back then. So
it just never occurred to them.
yeah,
It wasn't a thought they had. And they sat there on meetings with cigars, and Arno came home stinking of cigar tobacco. And the idea of a woman obtruding. I mean, Hans Reichmann had been a board member from the beginning.
yeah,
And there was Eva booming away as a scholar. And it was only with Hans Reichmann's death that her name was brought up. And Arno, to his astonishment, had to push.
yeah, right,
He was startled
yeah,
because he was a great admirer of Eva.
yeah,
It was odd because by then thinking had changed.
yeah.
Not as much as now, perhaps, but certainly.
It does seem extraordinary by today's standards
Yes.
that a scholar like Eva Reichmann,
Yes.
there would have been any question about her being on the board. But it does show actually how not only how different the times were then, but also the mentalities of the men who, as you said, came from an even earlier generation. But that's how things were. An interesting thing that you raised actually about Arno's work to keep the London branch of the Institute open.
Yes.
I think he probably saved it.
I think so. I know it seems an exaggerated idea, but he really did. He felt it was important to have this English moderating voice. And the people they appointed as directors in New York were not scholars. They were always fundraisers. Fred Grubel, he'd been a lawyer in Leipzig. And then Carol whatnot, she insulted many of the scholars. She just saw it as a collection to raise money for, and so on. And Marion Kaplan, who after all worked on women, she said that when she was given some kind of position in the New York Institute, she thought she was in a madhouse. These are her very words.
Because they were not serious scholars, or
I think that was her complaint. Yes, that they weren't encouraged. Arno was offered 3 different jobs, which he didn't take. 2 in Germany and the New York one.
he was offered.
But he felt that the Yearbook Institute in London would collapse if he wasn't fighting for it. At the time, he was offered, when Werner Jochmann died in Hamburg, Arno was offered Hamburg, but he suggested Monica Richards, then Steffi Springoren, who's in the Berlin one.
Yeah.
And Arno was offered the Berlin one.
Right. But wanted to stay in London.
Wanted to stay in London. He felt it was worthwhile keeping it as a kind of balanced German jury here, here.
Yeah.
Instead of just here.
Yeah.
And the views of the Jerusalem group were so different from of the American that it needed a kind of middle. That was his idea.
Yes. I think that still is the case a little bit. But I think it's the question that we're grappling with now is, what does a Yearbook Institute in London mean today, when that first generation has gone? Peter Balzer said when he retired that German-speaking Jewry is now an English-speaking Jewry. And I suppose, what does that mean for the future? I mean, does that link to German culture, German Jewish culture, disappear eventually, as those of a German Jewish background just become British Jews? Or
well, the Yearbook Institute in New York sent its archive to Berlin because they said the next generation don't know German.
No.
The American scholars.
Unless they've made an effort to learn it, they won't even have learned it from their parents necessarily. That linguistic link has gone. So I think that does pose serious questions about what we as an institute represent and do in the future. But I think there is still a great interest in the history.
Surely, because it's, I don't want to say unique, but here's a group who, from emancipation to annihilation, there's a whole sort of story with a beginning and a terrible end.
Yeah.
Such a hopeful beginning.
It is, yeah. And it is a unique.
I can't think of any other group.
And really quite time-bound as well, you know. It's not as you say, between emancipation and destruction is really only a few decades. But in which the most extraordinary cultural achievements, scientific achievements, literary achievement,
Exactly. It's astonishing, isn't it, that this particular group of Jewry, as their relationship with German culture, fired them as well.
Yeah, it's sort of, it's exploded, it flourished into something, and then, of course, just as quickly was gone. And then you have the people, the scholars are dispersed all over the world.
And look what they contributed as a group, as an immigrant group. It was an astonishing... I mean, it was largely middle class.
Yes.
Largely.
Yes.
I mean, there was a Jewish proletariat, but not very visible. And also, it was a educated group. And what they gave to British and American society is astonishing compared with other immigrant groups.
Yeah, certainly. So I think that interest will continue.
That I think should.
Yeah. And I think at the present time as well, it's important to keep that memory present in people's minds of what can happen as well. When a minority group is demonized in such a way. You were listening to me, Joseph Cronin, talking to Pauline Paucker about her experiences with the LBI London and much else besides. You can listen to more of our podcasts on our website, leobeck.co.uk.